A North Atlantic iceberg was struck by the Titanic at 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, in the late afternoon at a speed of 20.5 knots, 23.6 miles per hour. The berg tore open the hull between 5 of the adjacent watertight compartments. As it scraped along the starboard or right side of the hull below the waterline, Titanic might have managed to stay afloat if only 1 or 2 of the compartments had been cut open, but when so many were, the watertight integrity of the entire forward section of the hull was catastrophically compromised. Only 705 of the 1,317 passengers on board the ship made it out alive. This gallery of images depicts the Titanic and its tragic voyage, the only thing the rescuers could see by the light of the moon when the ocean line Carpathia arrived at the location in the North Atlantic Ocean where the Titanic sank was some wreckage and lifeboats carrying passengers. Several of the passengers on the Titanic had awoken in their pajamas from their bunks and were completely unprepared to enter the lifeboats. By the time Carpathia got on the scene, the survivors had been hit hard by the cold weather and were suffering from exposure, severe stress, and shock. The Carpathia's sympathetic passengers gave the 705 survivors bulky, warm garments as they boarded the rescue ship after tossing their life jackets into piles on the deck. A passenger on the Carpathia, the vessel that responded to the Titanic's distress call and rescued the survivors, took this picture. It depicts Titanic survivors in a lifeboat that is noticeably underpopulated. Titanic was traveling at 20.5 knots when it collided with an iceberg in the North Atlantic at 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912. 23.6 miles per hour. The berg tore open the hull between 5 of the adjacent watertight compartments as it scraped along the starboard or right side of the hull below the waterline. Titanic might have managed to stay afloat if only 1 or 2 of the compartments had been cut open, but when so many were, the watertight integrity of the entire forward section of the hull was catastrophically compromised. On April 15, at 2:20 a.m., the Titanic sank beneath the water. Only a few lifeboats were present when the Cunard liner RMS Carpathia arrived at the scene 2 hours after Titanic sank, and there were no survivors in the 28-degree water. Without knowing any better, Bernie Palmer gave the rights to her photographs of the Titanic iceberg and survivors to Underwood and Underwood of New York for just $10. The young couple in this photo is Mr. and Mrs. George A. Harder of Brooklyn, New York, who are honeymooning. Mrs. Charles M. Hayes is the lady facing Bernie's Browning camera. Her husband was the president of the Grand Trunk Railway. He perished in the shipwreck, but Carpathia was able to save Mrs. Hayes and her 2 girls. The RMS Carpathia arrived in the region more than 2 hours after the catastrophe and started pulling people out of their lifeboats. This image of the Titanic's sinking iceberg was shot by Stefan Rehorek, the BBC reports. If you look closely, you may see paint remnants left behind on the iceberg at the ship's side. On April 20, Stefan Rehorek traveled on board the Bremen on a ship that passed through the waters where the Titanic sank. When they arrived at the scene of the accident, the passengers saw debris and the floating bodies of more than 100 victims. Fewer than 1/3 of the passengers on the Titanic were alive when it sank. A few survivors perished shortly after. Several of those carried aboard Carpathia perished as a result of exposure-related illnesses and injuries. Although the Titanic had more lifeboats than the British Board of Trade mandated, only 1,178 passengers could fit in its 20 boats, much fewer than the total number of passengers. Because crew members were concerned that the davits would not be able to withstand the weight of a fully filled boat, lifeboats were released much below capacity, which made the issue worse. Although it had room for 65, lifeboat number 7, which was the first to depart the Titanic, only held roughly 27 passengers. Just 705 people would ultimately be saved in lifeboats. Following its sinking, the Titanic's lifeboats were left to White Star Line's Pier 54 in New York City. Around 1,317 individuals boarded the Titanic, including 324 passengers in first class, 284 in second class, and 709 in third class. There were 107 kids on board, with third class housing the majority of them. On her inaugural journey, the ship carried a lot less passengers than she could have, 2,566. A sighting of an iceberg was reported to the bridge at approximately 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, about 400 nautical miles, 740 kilometers, south of Newfoundland, Canada. First Officer William Murdoch gave the orders to reverse the engines and turn the ship hard a starboard, to the right. Though it was too close to avoid a crash, the Titanic started to spin. Murdoch actually made the Titanic turn more slowly by reversing the engines than if it had been going at its original speed. The majority of experts think the ship would have survived if it had collided head-on with the iceberg. Historic Dutch-inspired decor can be found in Stateroom B59. The survival percentages of the various classes on the Titanic were drastically different. Although only 3% of first-class women perished, 54% of third-class women did. Similarly, all of the second-class children and 5 out of 6 first-class children survived, while 52 out of the 79 third-class children died.